about the history of Cinco de Mayo. A lot of you probably already know some of the history, you might know a lot of the history, but just briefly I want to tell you why it's important. First off, Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican Independence Day. That is September, on September 16th. What Cinco de Mayo is, it's a celebration of a much smaller Mexican army that was ill-equipped to repel an invading army. And the invading army was France. What had happened was Mexico had been devastated through revolution after revolution, civil war, losing the northern half of its territories to the United States, and its economy was completely in shambles. And what happened was they had built up a huge debt to Spain, England, and France for fighting against the United States and for fighting among each other. And what happened was France had lost most of its countries and colonies that it had built up through its empire. And it wanted to rebuild its empire. And it saw Mexico as being ripe for the picking. And so they wanted to reestablish a presence. So they sent an army over. And it was in Puebla, high up in the mountains, where the army, the Mexican army, were on donkeys, these small mountain horses, and the French army just laughed at them. They said, how can you fight us with a donkey? How can you fight us with a little mountain pony? We have these big war horses. The problem was, war horses aren't built for running around in mountainsides. And that was one of the ways the Mexican army managed to defeat them, by luring them up into the mountains and decimating the French army. Unfortunately, what happens after that is that the French army comes back and they eventually take over all of Mexico. But the Mexican people never forgot that they had defeated the French against all odds. And what they did was they kept rallying around Cinco de Mayo saying we did it once before and we can do it again. And they kept organizing and planning, and eventually what happened was another country started to help arming them again to fight the French army. And that was the United States, because they had just won the Civil War, and they were scared about a new neighbor coming up. And they were especially scared about any European nation that wanted to build an empire in the Western Hemisphere. And so they decided to try to help the Mexicans. And the Mexicans took it, because they would rather take aid from the United States than live underneath a French government as another colony once again. And for this reason, we celebrate Cinco de Mayo just because it shows how an underdog can defeat someone who's much more powerful and much more organized, or at least appears that way. When we look at it politically, it shows us that if you make the right decisions, and you plan and you make strategies, you can eventually defeat a much more powerful enemy. What's interesting about this is decades later, the Puebla fight happened in 1862, but what happens is decades later, it's just a small celebration in Mexico, except in Puebla, it's huge. But all of a sudden, for some reason, in the late 20th century, Midwestern cities with larger Mexican populations started celebrating Cinco de Mayo because it's springtime. And what do we like to do in spring after a cold winter? Party. Get outside. And Mexicans were looking for a reason to celebrate, getting through another cold, hard Minnesota winter. And Minnesota, St. Paul specifically, becomes the hotbed of Cinco de Mayo. And it becomes a very huge holiday here. Right, where if you go to Cinco de Mayo now, whether it's on the west side or whether it's on Lake Street in South Minneapolis, there's lots of people. It's one of the largest spring festivals and summer festivals in all of Minnesota. What's hilarious about that is 20 years ago, it was really small and tiny. But what the Mexicans did once again was to say, what do people like to do in Minnesota after a long, cold winter? They want to do the same things we want to do. And they used it as a chance to build up pride and to showcase what the Mexicans have done in the West Side and what the other Latino groups have moved in, Puerto Ricans and Ecuadorianos, to just showcase Latino culture and Mexican culture. And to really remind people that we're here, we're still going to celebrate life, because no matter what hardships we faced in the past, celebration has been one of the keys for us surviving. So that's it. I'd like to encourage you to enjoy this day and celebrate and remember it's about overcoming against all odds, and use that to help finish out the semester.